All right, now with our event model in place, we want to introduce a best practice for working with model classes in your applications. And it might not be obvious why we're going to be doing this, but it'll become clear as we move towards putting our data in databases. Right now, what we're going to do is we're going to add a new property. It's going to be a unique integer identifier for our class. So it's basically going to be a way for each new event class we create, or rather, each new event object that we create to have its own unique integer, and that'll be a way to identify each object and to tell them apart as well. So let's make a private int. I could spell it correctly, private with an E, int, and let's just call this ID. All right, and the thing I want to do is I don't want to leave this. I could initialize this ID in the constructor, and actually that is what I'm going to be doing. I could have it passed in, but I don't want to do that because I don't want to allow someone to create event objects and to specify the ID, because that would essentially let them pick the ID and create the possibility of creating two objects that are different that have the same ID, which is not what we want. So we're going to handle the initialization of this ID field, and we're going to do it in a sort of a clever way here. So I'm going to make a new field, actually. Let me say private static int, and I'm going to call this next ID, and I'm going to initialize that to 1. And so this is essentially going to be a static counter. So remember, static means that this field belongs to the class rather than any one instance of the object. In other words, every single event object will share the same static next ID field. And by initializing this to 1, I'm saying this is going to be the ID of the next event object that's created, and then I can update that counter to 2. And so by that means the second object would have the ID 2, and so on, ensuring that every single event object we create has a unique ID. So let's go ahead and do that in the constructor. I'm going to say this.id equals next ID. And then I need to increment this to make sure that it's unique. So I'm going to say next ID plus plus. That adds 1 to the next ID field. And that should initialize the ID correctly. Let's add getters and setters for this. So down below, I'm going to use my auto generate. Actually, you know what? I want to cancel out. I don't want to make a setter. We don't want to be able to set the ID. Once the ID is initialized in the constructor, it should not change. So let's just make a getter. All right, there we go. We don't need to expose the next ID field. That one's going to remain private. That does not need to be used anywhere outside of the class. It's just being used for this initialization, so it'll stay private with no getter. Okay, so in every event object we create will have a unique integer ID. In order to test this, let's just make this visible somewhere. We need to go, say, to our event listing, and let's put a column on our event listing table that just displays the ID. Not that the user would want to see this, but this will allow us to test it nice and easily. So I made a new table header element with ID as the column label, and then within my loop, I'm going to reference event.id in my th text. So I have a new td element with th text equals event.id, and that should reference the getter for the ID field, and we should see that displayed. So let's go ahead and test this out. So these IDs are going to give us a very, very easy way to tell whether or not objects are the same or different. They're also going to be used to identify the data that we store in our database later on when we get to storing our data in a SQL database. So that'll be useful there. Okay, so let's refresh the page. We see we have a new column here. Let's go to create a new event and see if we get an ID on that event. All right, great, we do. So the first event I created was ID 1. That's because the static counter was initialized to have the value 1. If everything works correctly, I should be able to create a second event and see that that event has ID 2. Great, that works. Just for fun, let's create a third event. All right, Code with Pride, the LaunchCode meetup there. It's LGBTQ+ friendly. So we've got 3 events here now, and each has a unique ID because that counter is static. Now, if we hadn't made that static, we would see all of these actually have the same ID, which would be 1. So that static is an important modifier on that counter field. And one more thing I want to do before we close up this lesson, I'm going to kill my application for now. As I mentioned previously that we said we should generally create our own .equals and .hashcode methods within our Java classes, and I haven't done that yet. I said I was going to do it eventually. Now is the time to do it. I'm going to go to the very bottom of my class, and the reason why I waited until now to do this is, remember .equals is going to enable comparison of one event object to another. Or in general, it's going to, it allows comparison of two objects of the same data type. So to do that, we could have just used, the data we had previously, the name and description. But now that we have an ID, there's actually a sort of more ironclad way to compare these. I want to consider event objects to be the same if and only if they have the exact same ID. So even if they have the same name and same description, but they have different IDs, they should not be considered the same object. Or they should not be considered equal, rather. So let's go down and generate, and we can say .equals and hashcode within our generate. And so IntelliJ will do this for you. So you've got a couple options here, and the default should be okay. And in the second portion of this dialog, you just have to select the fields that you want to compare when .equals and hashcode runs. We're only going to use the ID field, so we'll uncheck name and description. All right, and let's see. So we have an equals that takes an object, and this some stuff up here, which you may recall is basically some quick shortcutting to easily tell if it's obviously a different object or the same object. So I'll leave that to you to read, even though we've covered it a little bit before. And down below, we notice that we're returning the Boolean value of this comparison, which compares the ID of the object that we're inside of with the ID of the object that has been passed in. And then the hash code just hashes the ID field value. Okay, so we'll leave those there. We're not going to use them for now, but as a best practice, they should always be there when you create your own Java objects.